Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again today as we continue our discussion on the book of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I really hope you're getting a lot out of this study, and I hope you're starting to use some of these principles that I've been covering that come in the book, but also I've been sharing them with you and talking about these principles maybe a little bit more in detail, and then adding some things also. But truthfully, if you use these principles that I've been sharing with you about how to recognize a literary genre, how to read and understand it, how it communicates, will give you so many insights into the text, and it's going to prevent you from making a foolish mistake. So you're more than likely to make a mistake in the way that you understand some kind of instruction by not recognizing the genre and by not respecting the way that genre communicates. You're more than likely to misspeak about something. Whereas if you follow the guidelines that I'm sharing with you and you use these different approaches and understand how different literary genres communicate, you'll be able to grasp some incredible insights. And also it's going to lead you into greater levels of research. So start asking the right questions, which will lead you to searching for different pieces of information that help to enrich whatever it is you're studying. This week I want to talk about parables. I think it's chapter 8 in our book. But we'll talk about parables. This will be the last bit. We talk about the Gospels. So the parables are very, very interesting, and I love to study the parables. Real quickly, just kind of to get rid of some misinformation out there. Try to rid us of some misinformation about parables that came from prior generations. One thing, a lot of times a long time ago, people would say a parable is a very simple story. Or they'd say something effective like it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. People would often say that parables were something that Jesus created in order to teach. Other things like this. These are all myths that are not true. In fact, parables can be very complex, very, very complex. And the way that you measure the complexity, there's not a standard that I could point you to, but just understand this. Generally, the more characters that are in a parable, the more complex it's going to be because you have more possibility for more speech coming from different characters. You have more interplay between characters, a lot more actions. There's a lot more going on. When more characters you have, it generally raises the level of complexity of a parable. So these are not simple stories, not by a long shot. Very few. Now, maybe the parable of the seed, or not the seed, but the leaven, would be considered a very simple parable. Well, it's there's not any characters. It's really, really small. Or the parable about the kingdom of God, and some of those parables in Matthew 13, they're just incredibly short. So those are simple, but the most part, parables are very, very complex. And again, the complexity generally parallels with the number of characters. Now, about them being unique teachings in Jesus' ministry, that's not true either. We have a parable in the Old Testament. The prophet Nathan speaks a parable to King David during the time that David makes this horrible choice with Bathsheba and commits a horrible sin, and we have this adulterous relationship. Well, anyway, Nathan confronts David about it. And Nathan uses a parable. It's a parable about the sheep where a rich landowner took the sheep of a poor owner away. It's a parable. So we have these in the Old Testament. And they're used in other cultures too. They may be called something else, but the Greek people use this too, Greek cultures. In fact, they encourage this kind of behavior in rhetoric. Usually these kinds of illustrations, actually they're called proofs in Greek rhetoric. These proofs are used to validate a person's point or their argument. Like, makes my argument true, something to that effect. They are considered an inartificial proof because they are fictitious. They're made up stories. So they're not of the same caliber as using a authoritative text like the Old Testament scriptures, but a parable or a story can have a rhetorical effect in that it creates a fictitious account where some lesson that's associated with the exhortation that's being offered is revealed along with this as an illustration. Let's put it that way, a way to understand how this all works out. And so when we're looking at these parables, this is another important thing to understand. I'll come back to this. When we're looking at parables in the Gospels, you need to understand that parables almost always work in conjunction with other exhortation. So the parable itself is not the exhortation, generally. Now, sometimes it will be, because the way that they have compiled the Gospels. Okay, so we don't have just every occurrence of what Jesus is doing in the Gospels. We just don't have that. We have a very limited amount of information. But generally, following the guidelines of Greek rhetoric, would be that you use these in order to enhance your teaching or exhortation, something you've already offered, and then this is offered in a way to enhance your persuasion towards something, your ability to persuade other people. Let's put it that way. So it's used in that way. Now, the Jewish people called them mashals. There was a Jewish culture. I mean, parables we know just from the Gospels that it was part of the Jewish culture, but they didn't call them parables, they called them mashal. And for them, they're just considered riddles. That's generally how that word's translated, as riddles. And this idea is often associated with wisdom style of writings too. So, mashal. But anyway, the point being is that it's not unique to Jewish culture. The Jewish culture uses it though, but Greek culture also uses this. And so this is not something unique. It is something that's used pretty broadly and generally. Now, the word parable itself is a Greek word. Paraboles is the word. Paraboles. So the word itself simply means this: to throw alongside. That's what parable means. To throw alongside. Now, remember what I was telling you, that the parables are often associated with some kind of exhortation. So a person offers some kind of exhortation, and then they throw an illustration alongside, a paraboles. They throw something alongside this illustration. And that's what it is. It's to throw alongside of the exhortation in order to give you a different way of viewing how this applies, I guess, in some sense, or how it could be applicable, or how you understand this to work out. In fact, this will be very important in a parable we're going to look at a little bit later. So, now, it's also important that when you're looking at these parables, as I said, try to find exhortation, but also understand that these parables are going to fit into a larger context. Many times people just make the mistake of not looking broad enough in the context really to have a good idea of what is trying to be communicated thematically. It's really important that you look at information before the parable, looking for exhortation, looking for other things going on that might give you some clues about why this illustration is thrown alongside, and material afterwards, because material afterwards may also be instructive to some degree about the lesson that's come from the parable, or it may give you an example of some outworking of that parable maybe. But just realize that there's a lot more around the parable that needs to be looked at also, and you need to make your search, you need to broaden it out to understand, maybe a chapter before, a chapter afterwards, maybe even more than that, but definitely at least look a few paragraphs before and a few paragraphs later to see if there's anything going on there to help you understand why this is being used in this way. Now, in the New Testament, parables only appear in the Gospels. So the Apostle Paul would have understood how to use these. He was a master in rhetoric. In fact, he uses allegory in Galatians chapter 4. Allegory is not a parable, but it's similar in what its purpose is. Let's put it this way. In fact, they often overlap considerably. So, for example, Matthew 13, the parable of the seeds, is an allegory, even though we call it a parable. There is no way that we would ever understand what the meaning of those seeds and what's going on with the animals and so forth, with these seeds and the destruction and the success of these seeds, if Jesus had not explained it to us. We would never guess that this is a seed that fell by the wayside and a bird, what that means, that Satan is involved or something to that effect. We just never would understand the meaning of that unless he would have explained it to us. Now, we're not going to approach every parable that way. But just understand that there is a possibility, especially if Jesus in this instance, and he tells us also, he explains the parable of the wheat and the tares also, and it's allegorical also. But we have to be a little bit careful how we use these. But anyway, what I was trying to say was allegories and parables are somewhat similar. So even though the Apostle Paul does not use parables, he uses something very similar in Galatians 4. He uses an allegory. Now, also, the purpose of Paul's writings really does not lend itself to using parables. He's generally reacting to something in a lot of his letters. So somebody from some community will send some kind of a correspondence, a letter, a message to Paul and say, hey, this has come up. What are we supposed to do in this situation? And then Paul will respond back. And, he usually has an accumulation of many things, like in the Corinthian correspondence, says he has many things that he has to cover. But all of these are reactionary to something, and he's trying to help the church through some kind of theological issue, maybe relationship problems, or something else. He's trying to help them out. So it really doesn't lend itself to a parable. Parables are more conducive in a setting of a teacher-student, a classroom setting. And that's what we often see in the ministry of Jesus. So Jesus is a rabbi, he's a teacher, and he has students, disciples that he's teaching. So we would expect, as we encounter these teaching moments or these teaching settings, that Jesus could use this kind of teaching technique. Whereas the Apostle Paul definitely could use it. There's no doubt about it. He could use it. But the situation that he's working in just doesn't lend itself very well to that type of communicative tool. Now, also, historical and social and cultural information is just vital. You're not going to understand these parables completely without that. You got to be better than in our history and knowing the social and cultural practices of the day. They are going to be very, very helpful. In fact, this is going to come up later on when we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, as you're looking at a parable, you need to use narrative analysis. It's a narrative, is what it is. It is a fictitious story, but it's a narrative. So you need all those elements that we've been talking about. Time. If there's time given, it's given for a reason. So make sure you take note of that and include it in your evaluation of the parable. Setting. If it's given, it's important. It could be implied. And so just realize that whatever the narrator gives you, he gives it to you for a reason. And if he doesn't give it to you, he could expect you to know it. He could expect you to know it. Or it's not important. And so that's where it takes a lot of wisdom, to like, what does the narrator expect the audience to know? And what is information that I should not be injecting into the story? Let's put it that way. So it takes wisdom, and the more you learn about historical and cultural and social information, you'll have that wisdom to know when it is what's applicable in most situations. Let's put it that way. It's going to help you a lot. Now, it's not foolproof, but it's a whole lot better than not having any information at all. Characters. There will always be characters. And here's what's so important about this. Only use the information about the characters that you have up to that point in the gospel. Yes, we know the whole story. And that's good. That's good we know the whole story, because it helps us to understand how things are evolving as we're looking at this, as we're going back and researching and studying, trying to understand it better so that we can have a closer walk with the Lord. It's good for us to know the whole story. But originally, they did not know the whole story, and they're working through this, sequentially. Let's put it that way. They're working chapter by chapter, verse by verse is what they're doing. They're reading through it. So as you come across these, in a narrative analysis, a character, you can only use the information that the narrator gives you up to a certain point. Now, in a parable, all we're going to have is what's in that story itself. Okay? So, but only use that information or information that might be associated with that person. So, for instance, if the character is a shepherd, then you should understand what the job of a shepherd is and how that person is viewed in society. So, for instance, shepherds were thought they were lowly people. Nobody wanted to be around shepherds. That's what makes the Luke Gospel birth story so unique, is that God shared it to the shepherds, the lowliest of people. And God said, I'm going to share this wonderful news to these people, that the first people that are going to hear it is what other people who think are lowly, but what I think are wonderful people. Let's just put it that way. God doesn't have that kind of distinction. He just sees people as they are. It's people who deem the importance of individuals, and that's one of our faults. But anyway, there's going to be a storyline, something relatable. The people will understand the story, the experience. They're going to understand, working in a field. They're going to understand going to a synagogue. They're going to understand about fishing. They're going to understand about, maybe some other kind of agricultural thing. They're going to understand these things, okay? So it's something that's very, very relatable. The story means it's when I say story, I mean it's some kind of event, occurrence that progresses as expected. So it has a beginning point, a middle, and an end. It's a story. I mean, it's going through, and you can expect certain things to happen within that story. But parables are unique in that they always have a twist. They always have the twist. Now, there could be more than one twist, but they're going to have something there that gives it shock value. That's what makes the parable so good, is that it shocks you. So it shocks you. It's you don't expect that to be said, and it's said. It's really a way to indict someone or chastise someone, I guess, in a polite way. You don't directly chastise that person or scold that person, but you instruct in an indirect way that you hope that the person will figure out as they think about the story and the lesson that's drawn from there, and maybe its applicability in whatever situation that they're dealing with. There's tension in the story, there's resolution. So it's a storyline. It's going to have cohesion, you're going to make sense. It's not going to talk about farmers barking or dogs farming. It's going to be something that you can relate to. Farmers planting a seed. Dogs running after, I don't know, some other animal or something. But it's going to be something relatable is what I mean, okay? There'll be tension in that story where the problem arises, and there'll have to be resolution. There will be speech or conversation between characters. Now, generally in a narrative, as a whole, we think about the Gospels as narratives, there's going to be exhortation in there. And where there is exhortation, it's always going to be where people are speaking. Now, parables are not going to have this as much because it's really the whole story that kind of comes together and gives us a lesson or lessons. But anyway, the speech, I would never underestimate the speech in a parable, and I'd always pay close attention to what's going on there because, again, it can enrich your understanding. Now, let's look at Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if you want to go ahead and read that, in fact, I urge you just to read all of Luke chapter 10. Just read the whole chapter, and then we can talk about it. So stop right here, go ahead and read Luke chapter 10, and then when you come back, just start it right back up. Okay, I'm assuming that you have read, so I will talk about this parable just a little bit. Now, first thing I want you to do is understand there is a context around this parable. It's not just sitting there on an island on its own. It is surrounded by other information. In fact, chapter 10 begins with a discourse about mission, about proclaiming the kingdom of God has come near. Jesus chooses 70 disciples, he pairs them up, and he sends them out on this mission journey. And so we have a mission discourse. The disciples come back. They tell Jesus how wonderful the results were for their ministry, how everything went so well. They're rejoicing, and Jesus is rejoicing. And then he begins to teach again. He begins to teach his disciples again. And as he is teaching, he is asked by an expert in the law. Now, why the expert in the law is there, we don't know for sure. I think it actually says that he wanted to test him. Yeah, it does. And verse 25 says he once stood up to test him. So maybe this person put himself in this position to try to create some difficulty for Jesus. Possible. But anyway, I have this expert in the law, okay, that's there. And he asks, what is it that I must do to have eternal life or everlasting life? That's the first question. He asked Jesus, what must I do to have everlasting life? And then Jesus responds by saying the two greatest commandments, love God with everything you have, basically, and love your neighbor as yourself. 2 commands. Deuteronomy 6, and then Leviticus 19. In fact, love God with everything you have is in several places in Deuteronomy. But Deuteronomy 6 is where it begins. And then love your neighbor as yourself is Leviticus 19. Okay, so this is where we get these. Okay. Then, after Jesus says that, the 2 greatest commandments, then the lawyer or the expert asks, who is my neighbor? That's what he asks. Then Jesus tells the story about the beaten and injured man. So that's where we're at. Now, before we get into the story itself, I also want to point out to you that the story of Mary and Martha afterwards may have some relevance to what's going on in the parable of the Good Samaritan also. In that, it looks like Martha is not being very merciful towards Mary. And Jesus kind of scolds her for it. But we'll get to that here in a second. So, Jesus begins to tell this story about this beaten and injured man. Now, there is not any time given in this story. Okay, there's not any time. But there is a setting. Setting is Jerusalem. In fact, it says this person is going from Jerusalem to Jericho. I know that the journey began in Jerusalem because it says he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So real quickly, Jerusalem sits very high. I think it's about a half a mile above sea level. It sits very high on a ridge or some kind of a shelf. It's not really a mountain range, but it's like a ridge, but it sits very high. And there's not really a good way to get in. There's only one way to get into Jerusalem at that time anyway. It's not much different now. But at that time, and you had to go up this road. But the ascent to Jerusalem was fairly long also. I mean, it set pretty high up. So when it says going down, they always say that because Jerusalem was higher than any other places around. So its elevation was higher. So they're actually talking about going down, walking down from Jerusalem. So we have that. Now, Jericho is also introduced. It's not as important. We just know that this seems to be the origin or the destination of the person. They're going that way. But here's one thing it's important that we need to know, that the narrator expects the audience to know, but we have to research to find out. Jericho's about 11 miles, 10 to 11 miles, maybe 12 miles from Jerusalem. That would be probably about a day's journey by foot. This is going to be important when we think about where this Samaritan took the injured man. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, okay? But if I'm correct, that the person that's injured is going from Jerusalem to Jericho, I think actually the Samaritan is going from, because it doesn't give us any information about his travel going up to Jerusalem or going down from Jerusalem. It doesn't say anything like that. But I think the Samaritan may be going into Jerusalem. Going in. Now, what's so interesting about this, as I said, is that Jericho's 10 to 11 miles away. I don't think that this injured person has gotten very far down the road. Not very far at all. And something's happened. I'm about positive. I wouldn't know any other way to understand it because of the distance, that the Samaritan takes the injured man back into Jerusalem to an inn. That's where he goes back. And the Samaritan is welcomed in Jerusalem. Okay? So, that's important, I think, when we come back to this. And they're descending from Jerusalem. So that's kind of our setting. It gives us some good idea. Now about the Samaritan coming to Jerusalem, and we see that a lot of people base the animosity between Jewish people and Samaritans as a founding element in this story, and it is one of the foundational elements. But here's some things to consider. If I'm correct, and I think I am, that when the Samaritan found the injured man, he took him back into Jerusalem and put him into an inn there, that the bias towards the Samaritan is not apparent at that point whenever the Samaritan person is using money. So there's no bias there whenever the Samaritan comes in to purchase a room. In fact, there's no bias anywhere else in the story, except it seems like by the priest and the Levite, and they have the bias towards the injured person. Everyone else is very accommodating towards other people. This is important to think about. Now the characters. Let's talk about the characters. So we have the beaten and the robbed man. Now notice this about the beaten and the robbed man. His ethnicity is not given. We just assume he's Jewish. But it doesn't tell us he was Jewish. He could be another ethnicity. And that may have been why the priest and the Levite won't have anything to do with him. Think of this. What if the injured man was a Samaritan? They hated the Samaritans. They're not going to help out a Samaritan. So it may not be about disrupting priestly duties. It may be about ethnical differences. But anyway, the ethnicity of the man is not given. Okay? So the priest and the Levite may have not have helped just because the person was another part of an ethnic group that's not Jewish. Okay? However, the injured man is accepted in the end. Again, it seems like the only bias that we have coming from are from the priest and the Levite. The ones that we would expect not to have any bias. The priest. He's expected to be the most pious. Now, he's coming from Jerusalem. He could be at the end of his priestly shift. Priestly duties could be over. It is possible that he has more to do and he has to come back the next day, so he doesn't want to make himself unclean. But he could still do something to help out the person. We expect him to do so, and we expect him to be the most pious. Of all the people that we expect to help, it's this person. This is the one that we expect have the highest expectation to do something. It's expected that he knows the guidelines of the Old Covenant best. Okay? And his behavior shocks us. And it should shock us. It was meant to. Then we have the Levite. So, not all Levites were priests. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. If you remember from the Old Testament, we had a narrowing of the priestly line. In fact, it begins at the very beginning, narrowing through the line of Aaron. Aaron is a Levite. In fact, a Levi would be Aaron's, several generations before, let's put it that way. Anyway, and so then it gets narrowed down to Aaron's line, and then it's going to get narrowed down to Phinehas's line, and then it's going to get narrowed down to the line of Zadok. So we have this narrowing down. So not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites. Now these Levites, many of them performed maintenance duties in the temple. They're there all the time. Many of them performed in choirs. They would have these worship choirs singing a lot of times. And so they're there in the temple all the time. We'd expect these people to exhibit behavior associated with the Old Covenant much more than just regular people that aren't in the temple on a regular day. The behavior of the Levite is shocking also, but it's not as shocking as the priest. But still, it is shocking that this person does not aid the injured person. Now, these first two people, the priest and the Levite, are Jewish. They are Jewish. There's no doubt about it. And they are following the Old Testament covenant. Now, here's what I'm getting ready to when I get ready to talk about the Samaritan, what I'm getting ready to say is where a lot of people, they don't understand, they don't see this, or they don't think about it. So, the Samaritan is not a pagan. In fact, the Samaritans were following the same Old Covenant as the Jewish people were. Same exact Old Covenant. They have the same exact first 5 books of the Bible. The Samaritans only held those first 5 books as authoritative. The Samaritan Pentateuch is what it was. But it was Genesis, it was Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now they had different names, but it's the same first 5 books. And the Samaritans are following the same Old Testament covenant as the Jewish people are. The Samaritans are worshiping the same God as the Jewish people are. The only difference is they're not coming to Jerusalem to do it. They're doing it on Mount Gezer. And so they're doing it in a different place. If you remember how the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, this comes out. So where are we supposed to worship at? That's the only difference. They're worshiping the same God. They're living under the same covenant. but they just worship in different places. This is really a story about spiritual competition. Now, this Samaritan is coming to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is accessible to this Samaritan person. So this person's coming to do something there. We don't know, business or something, I don't know. He's doing something. So he's coming there, and he has access. The Samaritans were a mixed race. They were a part of the northern kingdom that had basically separated itself from the southern kingdom after the reign of King Solomon. But they were taken over by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians immigrated people into that area, and the race itself, the ancient Hebrew people, were mixed with these, and they became a different type of a mixed race, but still they had that Hebrew heritage. They could trace their heritage back to Abraham, just like the Jewish people could. So they are a mixed race, but they are distant cousins of the Jewish people. The Jewish people just didn't like them because of their mixed race. In fact, I think the story of Ezra and Nehemiah probably is best viewed as a negative and not as a positive. When Ezra and Nehemiah forced the people to separate themselves from non-Jewish people, I think that starts a very negative trend in Jewish culture. And so I think this is an outworking of it. So the Samaritans worship the same God. They have the same Old Testament covenant, or the same framework for behavior, for worship, for festivals, etc. It's the same exact practices. Let's put it that way. This is really about spiritual competition, is all it is. In fact, a modern understanding of this would be probably if you were to use different Christian denominations and use those as the characters. You could use a preacher and a deacon, a preacher and an elder, and then some other Christian denomination, whatever. It's not part of your fellowship. But anyway, the Samaritan and Jewish people don't like the Samaritans, and it's really about spiritual competition. Now, there is a story here. Okay, so we have a story. Now, the first two people should have stopped and helped. We're shocked that they don't. And again, we don't know the ethnicity of the injured man. We don't. But the Samaritan helps. And this is even more shocking to the Jewish ear. Not to ours, to the Jewish ear. Because for them, they're thinking the Samaritans are just not good people. Well, they don't know. They don't even know any Samaritan people. This is all that they've heard this from biased people. But what the Samaritan does is most shocking. Now, there's a tension point. There's a tension point. When the priest goes by, we start having tension. No help. The Levite goes by, we have tension. Okay, as these people pass by, there's tension. Will the man live? Will the man make it? And the resolution comes when the Samaritan helps. And again, it's shocking, but the Samaritan helps. But not only does he help, but he also binds the wounds of the man, and then he purchases a room or shelter for the person, and tells the person that if there's anything more that's needed, he'll come back the next day and pay for whatever is extra that's needed. Now, speech. There's not very much speech in this parable at all, but the only one who speaks is the Samaritan. It's interesting. That's the only person who speaks. And he speaks to the innkeeper. And his remarks only heighten his nobility in that he says, I have more money if it's needed, if you need to do something else in order to help this person become well again. And he's willing to pay even more. So the status, his nobility even increases all the way through. Now, when the story's over, Jesus asks, who shows mercy? So now remember, the guy asked, who is the neighbor? Now this is interesting about the neighbor. So what we're dealing with in this story is all people who are living under the old covenant. So the term neighbor is dealing with people who are in the same covenant. It's not dealing with people who are not. Yes, the Samaritans were under the same covenant. Even though the Jewish people would chastise them and want to be like, they're not the same type of whatever, godly people or covenant people as we are. They were. They actually were. It's just spiritual competition between humans. But anyway, he says, who was merciful? And it was a Samaritan that was merciful. So there is a lesson about mercy there. A broad general lesson about mercy. And the mercy has to be directed pointedly to your covenant participants. So think about it. In the new covenant, the principle would be that we have to show mercy to other people in the new covenant. No matter what their denomination is, Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, Lutheran, doesn't matter. They're Christians. We have to show them mercy. That's the lesson. That's the lesson. This is also a lesson about inclusivity among covenant people. Yeah, we humans tend to exclude people. And we do have scripture that gives us a lot of good instruction. There's no doubt about it, about how we're supposed to do certain things, how salvation works, how it's implemented in your life, Christian behavior, the Lord's return, character of God. There's lots and lots of information in there. There's no doubt about it. But this is a lesson about inclusivity, because generally people try to find ways to separate themselves from one another. We don't like to work together. We don't. And the divisiveness in our country right now is just making this much, much worse. And this, hopefully that poison does not leak into the church. But anyway, it's about inclusivity. There's also a lesson about the idea of the neighbor. I talked about that just a second ago, about helping other people in the covenant. So that is our neighbor. For Christians, it would be other Christians. Now, there's a lesson about hypocrisy here too. Because we expect the priest and the Levite to do this behavior. It's taught in the Old Covenant to take care of one another. This kind of situation they should have. So this is hypocrisy. They know what they're supposed to do, yet they do not do it. So, in this simple story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, there are many points of instruction. Many, many points, because we have three characters, basically. Well, 4. You have the injured man. You could even count that person. You could count the innkeeper, 5. I mean, there's lots to look at with this in this parable. And what I'm saying is, the more characters you have, even though some of them might be extremely minor, like the innkeeper is an extremely minor role. More characters you have, generally the complexity of the parable raises. So it elevates. Now, real quick about parables. So just some summary of this real quick. So always when you're looking at a parable, always think about a larger context. In fact, I talked about Mary and Martha at the end of this. I think Mary and Martha are placed after this parable because Martha is not being very merciful towards her sister. So this is just another example of someone not being merciful, and Jesus gets on to her about it. And he says, basically Mary's chose what's better, Martha. And so why are you being so difficult toward her? That kind of idea. But always check the context all the way around it. It's important to understand what is going on as you're looking at this parable, because the parable itself is not supposed to be the main point of instruction. It is only to be an illustration that is thrown alongside to help you understand the lesson in a practical layout, a practical situation. Complexity. Don't get caught up in this simple idea that parables are simple stories. They are not. They are very complex and they are very profound. And generally, like I said, the complexity of the parable parallels with the number of characters. When you're looking at these parables, analyze them using narrative methodological approach, as I've been talking to you about. Use time and setting. Make sure you look for those things and evaluate that information. There's going to be information about the characters and character development. There's going to be some kind of a story there, and the story is going to have tension and resolution. And then pay close attention to any kind of speech that comes out, because within the speech there's often good pieces of information that help you to understand or enrich what is being said within the parable. All right, I hope that helps you out on the parables. Read the chapter on parables. It will be a very, very good read for you also. Next week, I want to talk about chapter 9. Yes, chapter 9. We're going to talk about the law in the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, and how to understand the Old Covenant. As we're reading through like Deuteronomy or something, or Leviticus, how do we understand this information, and how do we implement it into our lives? Let's put it that way. And so we'll be talking about the law next week and how we understand that type of literature. So I hope you're finding this helpful, and I'm really enjoying my time with you, and I look forward to next week. Take care. I'll see you. Bye.